A flight attendant heartlessly sprayed a baby with disinfectant as passengers watched in shock, but just 4 minutes later, he was sprayed with bullets. What happens next will leave you speechless. He turned disinfectant into a weapon against a baby. If you believe power should never excuse cruelty, subscribe now. The first warning came with a whisper that wasn't meant to be heard. You better keep that thing quiet. Nathaniel Creer's head turned slowly, uncertain if the voice belonged to the man striding past him or someone else nearby. But the look, sharp, pointed, laced with disdain, told him all he needed to know. Royce Trenner, the flight attendant assigned to the left aisle of Apex Air Flight 709, didn't bother to glance back as he marched toward the rear galley, his polished shoes tapping out a rhythm of contempt on the cabin floor. Nathaniel sat frozen for a moment, his 6-month-old son Isaiah cradled in his lap. The baby's soft cries, no louder than a hungry kitten's mew, had been building in hiccuped waves ever since boarding began. Nathaniel bounced him gently, whispering reassurances in a soft rhythm he had practiced night after night while overseas, in tents and barracks, where Isaiah's photos had kept him sane. But this wasn't a combat zone. This was supposed to be a peaceful flight home. And yet, the air inside the plane already felt charged, thick with something unspoken. A woman across the aisle sighed loudly and turned her head. A man 2 rows ahead shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The temperature seemed higher than usual, and a dull mechanical hum undercut the usual boarding chatter. Still, Nathaniel focused on his son's needs. He reached down and tugged Isaiah's blanket more snugly around his small body. The baby wriggled and cooed, one tiny fist gripping his father's thumb with surprising strength. Nathaniel smiled, even as he noted the sharp clatter of a beverage cart being yanked into position at the front of the plane. Then he saw Royce again. The flight attendant moved down the aisle with clipped efficiency, nodding mechanically at passengers, but his demeanor wasn't right. His uniform was pristine, creased in the right places, but there was something too rigid about him. Every movement seemed designed not to serve, but to endure. And when his eyes met Nathaniel's again, only for a split second, they didn't soften. They narrowed. Nathaniel lowered his gaze. This wasn't the time for confrontation. He just wanted to get through the next 2 hours without incident. After all, people got stressed during flights. Delays, schedules, crying babies. It wasn't personal, but part of him knew better. As the final passengers took their seats and the doors sealed with a heavy metallic thump, Nathaniel adjusted the strap of Isaiah's carrier and glanced out the oval window. The sun had dipped below the edge of the tarmac, casting the Silverport skyline in hues of orange and steel blue. The intercom crackled to life. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome aboard Apex Air Flight 709 with service to Briar Hill. Please fasten your seatbelts and ensure your tray tables are in the upright position. The voice was calm, professional, but it didn't belong to Royce. Nathaniel looked toward the front again. Royce was leaning over another passenger, pointing sternly at a bag that hadn't been stowed properly. His tone was audible even from several rows away. I said under the seat, not beside it. That's a safety violation. The passenger, a balding man in his 60s, muttered an apology and bent to fix the issue. Royce stood straight, adjusted his collar, and gave a tight nod before turning again. As he passed Nathaniel's row, Isaiah let out another soft cry. Royce's nostrils flared. We haven't even taken off, he muttered under his breath, this time just loud enough for Nathaniel to hear. It's going to be a long flight if that thing doesn't shut up. Nathaniel turned slowly. He's a baby, he said evenly, his voice quiet but firm. He's doing his best. Royce smirked without humor. Well, let's hope his best isn't as bad as yours. The words sank like a stone. Nathaniel said nothing, choosing instead to focus on his son. He pulled the bottle from the side pouch, checked the temperature. Still lukewarm. He'd wait until they reached cruising altitude before asking for warm water. The last thing he needed was another interaction with Royce Trenner. As the plane began to taxi, Nathaniel leaned back and closed his eyes for a moment. He tried to steady his breathing, recalling the mindfulness techniques he'd been taught during recovery training. Stay calm. Be the anchor. He had weathered much worse than a rude flight attendant. He could handle this. But something felt wrong. It wasn't just Royce's hostility. It was the overall energy. The hurried way the other crew member had avoided eye contact, the sharp tone of the gate agent as she ushered people in, the eerie hush that fell over the cabin once the engines roared to life. Nathaniel opened his eyes and scanned the cabin again. A young man with a messenger bag sat diagonally across from him, early 20s, probably a college student. The man caught Nathaniel's eye and offered a sympathetic shrug, nodding toward Royce. Nathaniel gave the barest of nods back. Maybe he wasn't imagining things. Maybe others felt it too. The plane lifted off the runway with a forceful push, and Isaiah whimpered at the shift in pressure. Nathaniel cupped his hand gently around the baby's head, whispering, "Shh, I've got you. Just a little while longer." Isaiah whimpered again, but his tiny eyes fluttered closed. The cabin lights dimmed. Royce reappeared at the front, speaking with the co-attendant, a stocky man with a tired expression. Their conversation was hushed, too quiet to decipher, but Royce's gestures were sharp and impatient. He pointed toward the back of the cabin, then down at the floor beneath Nathaniel's row. The other man glanced at Nathaniel briefly, then looked away. Nathaniel's stomach twisted. It was too early for turbulence, yet he felt it, an unsteady pressure not from outside, but from within. He looked down at Isaiah, who had settled again, breathing softly. A small hand reached upward and tugged at Nathaniel's collar. The father smiled faintly, brushing a kiss on his son's forehead. "Sometimes," he whispered, mostly to himself, "warning signs are disguised as whispers." The hiss of the aerosol can cut through the cabin like a blade. Without a word of warning, Royce Trenner lifted the industrial-sized canister and sprayed a harsh stream of disinfectant directly into the space between Nathaniel and his infant son. The fine mist hit the air with a sharp chemical scent, dense and suffocating. Isaiah's reaction was immediate. He jerked violently in Nathaniel's arms, letting out a high-pitched, ragged scream that fractured into coughing fits. His tiny fists flailed in panic, his eyelids squeezed tight, tears streaming down cheeks flushed red with irritation. The baby, choked, gagged, his breath coming in rapid, broken gasps. Nathaniel's entire body locked in place. For a full second he was frozen, not out of fear, but disbelief. Royce's face remained impassive, a cold smirk lingering at the edge of his lips. "This'll shut him up," he muttered, barely louder than the lingering hiss of the spray. The words hung in the air like poison. Gasps rippled across the cabin. One woman seated 2 rows up dropped her book. A teenage boy beside the aisle jerked upright, his earbuds falling from his ears. An elderly man shook his head slowly, mouth slightly open in stunned horror. But none moved fast enough. None could. Nathaniel moved. He twisted in his seat, wrapping his jacket around Isaiah's fragile body to shield him from the lingering mist. "Hey, what are you doing?" he snapped, his voice strained but forceful. The fabric of his coat rustled harshly as he used it to fan away the chemical cloud, his hand trembling. Not with fear, but fury barely restrained. The cabin's sterile lighting now seemed harsher, casting long, uneasy shadows across Royce's uniform. He didn't flinch. Instead, he took a single step back, nonchalantly adjusting the collar of his shirt like nothing had happened. His fingers were steady, his expression detached. Nathaniel's jaw clenched. "You sprayed chemicals on my baby." Royce offered a careless shrug, the can still in his hand. "Cabin sanitation protocol," he said smoothly. "We're required to keep the air safe." "The air?" Nathaniel echoed. He could feel Isaiah's shallow breathing against his chest, the baby's coughs now jagged sobs. "He's 6 months old." "And making quite a scene," Royce said, a pointed glance at the nearby passengers. "Some of us are trying to maintain order." A low murmur began behind them. One of the passengers, a man in his 20s with dark hair and glasses, stood halfway in his seat. "You sprayed a baby, man," he said, disbelief heavy in his voice. "That's not order. That's messed up." Royce turned sharply. "Sit down, sir. This doesn't concern you." "Doesn't concern me," the man said. He looked at Nathaniel, who was now pressing the call button repeatedly, the light blinking above. "That baby's struggling to breathe." "I said, sit down." Royce's tone shifted. It was a command, not a suggestion. Several passengers recoiled slightly at the sharpness of it, but the young man didn't back down. He looked to Nathaniel and offered a sympathetic shrug. "Sorry, man," he said. "Didn't think it'd get this weird." Nathaniel didn't answer. His focus was entirely on Isaiah, his tiny face blotchy with tears, gasping. The sound was wrong, deep, scratchy. He'd heard his son cry before, in airports, in taxis, even during thunderstorms, but never like this. Nathaniel's mind raced. He needed help. Fast. "Water," he muttered, glancing around. I asked for warm water 15 minutes ago. Royce didn't respond. That silence spoke volumes. Nathaniel's knuckles whitened around Isaiah's blanket. His pulse pounded against his skull. The fluorescent lights above flickered subtly, the recycled cabin air feeling thicker, heavier. Each second dragged. Every cough from Isaiah tore into him like a blade. One row back, someone began filming. A quiet chime indicated the co-attendant approaching from the galley, but he froze mid-step as he assessed the tension in the cabin. Eyes shifted. The air was tight with unspoken questions. Nathaniel turned to the man. I need a doctor, or a medic. Now. I'll check, the co-attendant stammered, then hurried back the way he came. Royce snorted. Overreacting's not going to help. Nathaniel finally stood. Slowly, deliberately, he rose to his full height, Isaiah still clutched close. The baby was beginning to calm slightly, worn out from the coughing fit, his breathing shallow but less frantic. Nathaniel's eyes were locked on Royce's, dark with intent. You ever raise that can again, he said, voice low and even, and I'll make sure you don't lift anything again for a very long time. It wasn't a threat. It was a promise. Royce said nothing this time. The cabin was still. Passengers watched in stunned silence, as if unsure whether they were witnessing a tantrum or something far more serious. In that moment, Nathaniel wasn't just a father. He wasn't just a passenger. He was a man at the edge, calculating, composed, but ready to strike if pushed further. And as Isaiah whimpered weakly into his shirt, the question shifted from what had happened to what would come next. Because what Royce had done wasn't just reckless. It wasn't even just cruel. It was a mistake. A mistake aimed at the wrong child. A mistake aimed at the wrong man. And Nathaniel knew, with an unshakable clarity, that this was no isolated incident. Something deeper was happening aboard this plane. He just didn't know what yet, but he would. And in that instant, silence screamed louder than words. The hiss of the aerosol can sliced through the air like a warning shot. Before anyone could react, a cloud of pungent mist burst toward the infant cradled in Nathaniel Creer's arms. The sharp chemical scent was immediate and overwhelming. Isaiah's eyes squeezed shut. He let out a high-pitched, painful scream, his small limbs thrashing. His tiny chest convulsed in rapid spasms, each cough more desperate than the last. Nathaniel reacted instinctively. He jerked back in his seat, wrapping Isaiah tightly in his jacket, shielding his baby's fragile lungs from the toxic vapor. His heart pounded so hard it rang in his ears. Panic thundered through his veins as he tried to soothe Isaiah, but the baby was gasping now, struggling for breath, his face turning red, then a dangerous shade of purple. "What did you just do?" a passenger shouted. In the aisle, chaos bloomed. Heads whipped around. Gasps echoed. Several passengers stood up, eyes wide, voices rising. Royce Trenner didn't flinch. The flight attendant's face held no remorse, only a cold sneer as he clutched the canister of industrial disinfectant in his gloved hand. "This'll shut him up," he said flatly, and for a second the entire cabin fell into stunned silence. Then it exploded. "You sprayed chemicals on a baby? Are you insane?" The voice came from 2 rows back. Colby Jacks, a rugged man in his late 30s with a medic's patch half visible under his jacket, leapt over his seat and rushed forward. He dropped to his knees beside Nathaniel, his hands already moving in practiced rhythm to assess the child's airway and pulse. Isaiah was coughing uncontrollably, his cries now muffled and weak. Foam gathered at the edge of his lips. Nathaniel's face was pale but tight with focus, his body curled protectively around his son. His mind was screaming, but his hands stayed steady. "He's not breathing right," Colby muttered, tapping Isaiah's chest and checking his color. "We need to land. Now." "I need oxygen," Nathaniel said, his voice low but firm. "Where's the mask?" Colby turned to the aisle. "Get me an emergency kit," he bellowed. Passengers began shouting. A man pulled out his phone. Another started filming. The aisle filled with outrage. "He just assaulted a baby." "Where's the captain?" "I want his name. What's his name?" Royce straightened, raising a hand to gesture toward the overhead speaker, but the shouting drowned him out. "It's standard procedure," Royce tried to insist, his tone forced and defensive. "Cabin sanitation." "With a commercial-grade canister?" Colby barked back. "You're lying. That baby could go into respiratory arrest." Royce's mask of calm cracked. He glared at Colby, then at Nathaniel, who met his eyes with a stare so cold it could shatter glass. Then, without another word, Royce turned and stormed toward the cockpit, brushing past a stunned co-attendant who looked too afraid to intervene. The door slammed behind him. Colby shook his head. "We need to get him on the ground. Now." Nathaniel nodded once. "Do what you can." As Colby tended to Isaiah, Nathaniel's right hand slipped into the inside pocket of his jacket. Beneath the liner, where a thread had been stitched with deliberate precision, was a small black flash drive no longer than a pinky finger. He palmed it silently. The noise in the cabin masked everything. No one saw him lean slightly to the right. No one but Dorian Vale. The young man had been watching from his seat across the aisle, frozen like everyone else, but with something different in his eyes. Not just horror, but recognition. Nathaniel leaned in, his face close, voice barely audible. "A favor for a friend in need." The moment the wheels hit the runway at Mayfield Ridge, chaos broke loose inside the cabin. The brakes groaned under the emergency descent, and the sudden jolt startled several passengers, but Nathaniel Creer barely blinked. He was too focused on the bundle in his arms. Isaiah's tiny chest rose and fell in erratic spasms, each breath sounding more like a gasp through a wind tunnel. The infant's face was flushed, his lips tinged a frightening bluish gray. Nathaniel had one arm curled protectively around his son, and the other raised as paramedics stormed the aisle toward him. "Move!" shouted one responder, a young man with cropped hair and a sharp jawline. "We've got him," another added as they reached the row. Nathaniel hesitated for a second, his grip tightening, but then loosened his hold, reluctantly handing Isaiah over. The baby whimpered, coughing weakly as a medic placed an oxygen mask over his face. The gurney wheeled away before Nathaniel could say goodbye. He tried to follow, but two Apex Air Security personnel blocked his path, their navy blazers emblazoned with the airline's silver insignia. "Sir, we need you to come with us," the taller one said, placing a hand on Nathaniel's shoulder. "What?" Nathaniel stared at him. "My son needs me." "You've been reported for causing a disturbance," the man interrupted, his tone clipped. "We've received a formal complaint from a senior crew member. We'll need you to cooperate." Nathaniel's voice dropped to a near whisper. "He sprayed chemicals into my baby's face." The security officer didn't flinch. "We'll sort that out. Right now, please step this way." Passengers protested behind him. One older man stood and raised his voice. "That's not right. We all saw what happened. He didn't do anything wrong." But the crew ignored the objections. Nathaniel gave the man a grateful glance, then looked back at the retreating gurney vanishing into the terminal. A fire sparked behind his calm eyes, but he didn't resist. As they led him down the jet bridge into a side corridor away from the terminal's main foot traffic, Nathaniel caught a reflection in the window, a flicker of movement. Dorian Vale, the young man from earlier, was slipping away from the crowd, his hood pulled up, his backpack slung low. Nathaniel exhaled quietly, almost a nod. He hadn't needed to say more. In a private holding room, a rotund supervisor wearing a tight lanyard and a forced smile tried to play the part of a neutral mediator. "We just need a statement, Mr. Creer," he said, tapping a digital pad. "You can file a counter-complaint later, but our priority is keeping the peace on our aircrafts." Nathaniel didn't sit. "File your lies," he said flatly, his voice as cold as steel. "But make sure you keep your cameras off me. You won't like what gets triggered." The supervisor blinked, startled, and faltered with his next words. But Nathaniel had already turned toward the window, watching the last flickers of flashing ambulance lights fade into the distance. The rage in his chest wasn't loud, but it was deep, and it was building. Meanwhile, outside the terminal, Dorian moved with quiet urgency. He ducked into a side alley between two cargo sheds, one hand gripping the flash drive that Nathaniel had passed him just before the landing. There had been no instructions, just a single sentence. "A favor for a friend in need." Crouching behind a stack of luggage carts, he pulled out his phone, connected a compact adapter, and inserted the drive. Nothing happened at first. Then the screen blinked. A folder appeared. Lockpoint footage. Inside, a single video file. Dorian tapped it open. The clip began with static, then stabilized. A hanger. A familiar one, judging by the faded red lines on the concrete floor. The camera appeared to be mounted high on a wall, angled downward toward the center of the space. The timestamp looped in the corner. Then Royce appeared, still in uniform, unmistakable even in grainy resolution, walking beside two men in tactical vests. Together, they loaded heavy black crates onto a cargo ramp. The crates bore a strange red emblem, 3 interlocking triangles, sharp-edged and almost reptilian in shape. Each crate had no visible barcode, no airline label. The video cut briefly. The next segment was clearer, closer. A child was crying. Dorian froze. The footage now showed a small figure, an infant, held by an unknown man wearing a dark mask and gloves. The baby's face contorted with distress, the same face Dorian had seen just hours earlier in the cabin aisle. Isaiah. The clip glitched, looped once, then ended abruptly. Dorian sat back against the wall, heart pounding. "You're not just a flight attendant," he whispered, voice shaking. "And this wasn't just a tantrum." Royce's hands trembled slightly as the door slammed shut behind him. The private room inside Apex Air headquarters was cold and windowless, its walls lined with soundproof padding and a single metal table at its center. Fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting a sterile glow on the 2 men standing across from him. Both wore dark tactical suits, their expressions unreadable, their earpieces silent. "There's been a breach," one of them said without preamble, dropping a slim black folder onto the table. Royce blinked, confused, still reeling from the social media backlash that had erupted just hours ago. "What breach?" he asked, voice scratchy from stress and lack of sleep. The taller of the 2 stepped forward, flipping the folder open. A glossy photograph slid out, spinning slightly before settling on the table between them. The image was sharp. Nathaniel, years younger, stood among a group of masked operatives, rifle slung over his shoulder, a faint smirk on his lips. The insignia on his vest was unmistakable. Omega Cipher, one of the most elusive and classified paramilitary intelligence units to ever operate off-record. "That father," the agent growled, jabbing a finger toward the photo. "He's not just a tech guy. He's blacklisted." Royce's face paled. "What do you mean, blacklisted?" he stammered, taking a shaky step back. "You said he was just a civilian," he added, voice rising. "You never asked," the second man cut in, his tone colder than the first. They stared at Royce like wolves sizing up an injured deer. His mouth opened and closed, no words forming. His mind reeled back to the moment on the flight. The crying baby, the spray, the cameras, the sudden descent. He had thought it was overreaction. He had thought he was the one in control. "I didn't know," he said weakly, throat dry. "Exactly," the taller man snapped. "And now you've ignited a fire that can't be contained." Royce's knees buckled into the nearby chair. His chest heaved. His authority, his carefully maintained image, all of it felt hollow now. What's he going to do?" The 2 agents didn't answer. Instead, one of them turned toward the wall-mounted screen and tapped a remote. The screen came alive. Breaking news headlines scrolled across the bottom. A video had gone viral. Royce's own face, caught mid-sneer, hovered on screen beside a headline that read, "Flight attendant sprays infant with disinfectant. Airline faces international outcry." The agent's voice dropped. "This is spreading. Fast. You've compromised more than just yourself. That man," he gestured to Nathaniel's photo again, "was involved in operations so deep we still don't know what parts of him are classified." Royce's throat tightened. He remembered the baby's coughing, the father's eerie calm, and now it all made sense. That wasn't the calm of weakness. It was the calm of someone used to chaos, someone who had survived darker storms. Miles away, Dorian Vale sat hunched over a laptop in a dimly lit motel room, the glow of the screen reflecting in his glasses. He navigated through layers of encryption with practiced ease, fingers flying across the keyboard. The footage Nathaniel had handed him, the one that exposed Royce's involvement in far more than just a temper tantrum, was uploading to a secure whistleblower site known for releasing high-level leaks. The moment the bar hit 100%, Dorian leaned back and exhaled. The footage was now out of their hands. It would spread like wildfire. He picked up his phone and sent a single encrypted message. Package delivered. Across town, the nearby hospital room was quiet except for the soft beeping of Isaiah's monitor. The baby lay still, pale but stable, an oxygen tube gently resting beneath his nose. Outside the glass, Nathaniel stood with his arms crossed, watching every breath his son took. Colby Jacks approached slowly. Still wearing the wrinkled hoodie from earlier, fatigue etched across his face. "He'll be okay," Colby said gently, eyes fixed on the infant. Nathaniel nodded once, silent. Colby hesitated. "But what about you?" Nathaniel didn't answer right away. His mind wasn't in the room. It was in the hangar, in the files Dorian was decrypting, in the shadows of memories long buried. His jaw tensed. "Now I finish what I started 5 years ago," he said at last, his voice flat and distant. Colby blinked, confused. "Which is?" Nathaniel pulled out his phone and glanced at the latest alert. The news app flashed the video clip, Royce's face, his own voice mocking a child, and the rising storm of backlash consuming Apex Air. He showed the screen to Colby for a moment, then tucked the phone back in his pocket. "I clean house." His gaze never left the window. "Even snakes forget that some mice bite back." The headline hit every major news outlet within hours. Flight attendant sprays infant with disinfectant. The video clip, shaky, grainy, but unmistakable, showed Royce Trenner's outstretched hand unleashing a burst of chemical mist onto a crying baby's face. The scream that followed cut through even the muffled audio. It was Isaiah's, and the internet responded with fury, as Apex Air scrambled to release a statement calling it a misinterpreted sanitation measure. Royce was placed on temporary leave pending investigation. But it was far too late. The footage had already gone viral, picked apart by analysts, legal experts, and angry parents worldwide. Hashtags surged, protesters gathered outside airline offices, and Apex's stock tumbled. Yet, amid the chaos, one van remained still, parked just outside the airline's regional operations center in Briar Hill. Inside the dim, cramped surveillance van, Nathaniel sat in silence, his jaw clenched as the glow from multiple screens flickered across his face. A quiet hum from portable fans did little to fight the heat or the tension thickening in the air. He didn't blink, didn't shift. He only watched. Beside him, Dorian Vale tapped away at a ruggedized laptop, wires running into a stolen Ethernet line routed through a maintenance panel they'd accessed hours earlier. His fingers moved fast, practiced, each keystroke calculated and precise. Sweat rolled down his temple, but he didn't stop. The air in the van smelled faintly of plastic, dust, and tension. "This isn't just passenger lists," Dorian said, frowning at the screen as a new folder opened. "The footage you gave me wasn't the only thing on that drive." Nathaniel turned his head slowly, eyes narrowing. "What else?" "Encrypted manifests," Dorian muttered, scrolling. "Ghost flight logs. Look at this. Cargo routes that don't show up in the FAA system, flights with falsified crew rosters, and these crate IDs, they're tagged to diplomatic lanes. No inspections. It's a trafficking route, Nathaniel." Nathaniel stared at the blinking data for a moment, his expression unreadable. "Royce is the public face of it, a mule with a badge." Dorian's voice dropped to a whisper. "I thought this was about him being a bitter flight attendant with a power complex." Nathaniel leaned forward, his voice cold and sharp. "He is that. But it was never just about the tantrum. He went after my son." The two men sat in silence for a beat, the truth settling between them like a growing storm. Outside, distant traffic passed, oblivious. Inside the van, a new folder decrypted with a ping. Images now, not just text. Photos of hangars, crates being loaded, faces partially blurred, uniforms, logos, a red emblem painted on a steel container. Dorian stiffened. "Wait, that's the same logo from the footage. The red triangle." Nathaniel didn't flinch. He'd seen it before. Years ago, in a place no parent should ever be forced to remember. He nodded once. "They're trying to clean their tracks," Dorian added. "I'm getting pings from their security systems. Someone's scrubbing files in real time. We're not the only ones in their system." "Then move faster," Nathaniel said calmly, but with fire just under the surface. Dorian bit the inside of his cheek. "We just got lucky that baby's cry wasn't ignored. But Royce didn't just panic. He reacted like someone guarding something." Nathaniel's thoughts raced back to the flight, the delay before takeoff, the overheard whispers, Royce's insistence on silence. That cargo hold under our seats. Something was down there, something that couldn't risk attention. Dorian glanced over, eyes wide. "You think the crying would have blown the cover?" "I think the crying nearly exposed a crime in motion," Nathaniel said. Just then, the main screen lit up again. Another decrypted sequence. A cargo scan. Dated the same day as Flight 709. One crate, no manifest, no customs record, and a lock ID tied to a senior Apex executive. Dorian paled. "You've got to be kidding me." "They didn't just endanger my son," Nathaniel muttered, jaw tight, eyes locked on the screen. They endangered every innocent soul on that plane. He reached forward and tapped a folder. Download everything. Location tags, internal memos, security rosters. We need proof. Outside, thunder rumbled, though the skies above were clear. Inside the van, the storm had already begun. Dorian exhaled sharply, his voice barely audible now. "This wasn't about a crying baby," he said. Nathaniel didn't look away from the screen. Number this was about exposure, and now they're panicking. Dorian nodded slowly, breath steadying as the final files ticked down. That's when they're most vulnerable. Two sharp cracks shattered the quiet night. The black SUV came to a sudden, lurching stop in the middle of the dark rural bypass just outside Mayfield Ridge. Steam hissed from beneath the hood as the vehicle's front tires deflated, shredded by precise rifle shots. Inside, Royce Trenner jerked forward in his seat, the seatbelt snapping tight across his chest. The driver groaned, stunned. The guard in the passenger seat reached for his radio, but a loud thud on the windshield froze him in place. A second thud followed, then silence. Within seconds, the night was swallowed by shadows. The rear door was yanked open by a gloved hand. A blast of cold air swept into the vehicle, along with a low voice. "Out!" Before Royce could protest, rough arms pulled him from the car. A black bag slipped over his head, muffling his screams. The two guards didn't even put up a fight. Tranquilizer darts had already pierced their necks, their muscles limp, eyes fluttering closed. The SUV sat still on the empty road, lights flickering, engine dead. By the time Apex Backup reached the scene, the vehicle was empty, abandoned. Royce Trenner had vanished. The media labeled it a possible kidnapping. Surveillance footage from the area was mysteriously corrupted. Police released vague statements, but those with knowledge of Apex's internal affairs whispered a different truth. This wasn't a kidnapping, it was a targeted extraction. Far from city lights, deep within the dense woods north of Briar Hill, a compound lay hidden behind layers of reinforced fencing, motion sensors, and buried communication jammers. Inside a soundproof chamber beneath the main structure, a single bulb flickered overhead. The air was cool and metallic, humming with quiet dread. Royce Trenner sat strapped to a heavy steel chair bolted to the floor. Duct tape sealed his wrists. His mouth, though free, trembled. Across from him stood a man he had seen before, once, briefly, on a flight that had spiraled into chaos. But the version of Nathaniel Creer standing in front of him now was different. No longer the quiet, travel-weary father. This man carried a stillness that was dangerous, intentional, deadly. "You don't recognize me, do you?" Nathaniel asked, his voice calm but razor-sharp. Royce blinked through the dim light, his left eye already swelling from a bruise. His lips parted slowly, the gears of memory turning. Then, with dawning horror, he whispered, "You're the father." Nathaniel stepped closer, arms at his sides, the faint scar on his temple catching the overhead glare. "I'm the father," he said, his voice like steady thunder. "And the reason your little smuggling pipeline is about to go up in flames." Royce let out a scoffing laugh, though it came out more like a nervous cough. "You think you can stop this? You'll never touch them. You don't even know who they are." Nathaniel didn't flinch. He studied Royce with a look that held both pity and wrath. Then he turned to a nearby desk, picked up a remote, and clicked a button. A monitor on the wall behind him flickered to life. Royce's smirk faded instantly. Line after line of code filled the screen, classified clearance logs, personnel records, encrypted shipment manifests, all tied to Royce's security ID. As the files loaded, Nathaniel watched Royce's face, not the screen. He had seen enough of this rot. What he wanted now was to watch the rot realize it had been exposed. "That's your clearance key unlocking your own dirt," Nathaniel said softly. "Cargo tags, route diversions, black site coordinates. You've been moving ghosts for years. I'm just the man who finally turned on the lights." Royce clenched his jaw, trying to mask the panic welling in his chest. You won't make it out alive. They'll come for me." Nathaniel stepped closer until the only space between them was a breath. He knelt to meet Royce's eye level. "Let them come," he said. "I'm not hiding, and neither are the files you helped me access. By now, they're already being duplicated, scattered across more hands than you can count." A drop of sweat rolled down Royce's temple. He jerked his head toward the screen. "They'll bury it, just like they buried the others." Nathaniel leaned in, his voice now a whisper, but every word struck like a blade. "You sprayed chemicals at a 6-month-old baby. You did it with a grin. You did it because you thought no one would dare strike back." His tone grew darker, his gaze never wavering. "But you picked the wrong father." He stood up slowly, walked to the wall, and turned off the monitor. The room fell into partial darkness again, the tension thick enough to suffocate. As Royce trembled, bound and helpless, Nathaniel picked up a folder filled with Royce's own signatures on altered freight documents. He placed it carefully on the desk. Royce tried one last act of defiance, lifting his chin. "You still don't know who they are. You think a flash drive and a few files will be enough?" Nathaniel paused by the door, one hand on the handle, the other gripping the remote tightly. He looked back over his shoulder. "That's what you think?" He clicked the remote again. A second monitor on the far wall lit up. Royce's own Apex Air security clearance profile appeared, its access keys overwritten in real time. Dozens of names unspooled beneath it, handlers, flight codes, hidden assets. Royce stared, slack-jawed, as the truth of what Nathaniel had unearthed began to dawn. Nathaniel let the screen play on, its eerie glow bathing the room in cold light. He stepped back toward Royce, his voice now low and lethal. "You should have let my son cry." He sprayed a defenseless child and thought no one would intervene. If you believe every act of abuse must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Royce Trenner flinched as the heavy door clanged shut behind him. His wrists were raw from the restraints, his lips cracked, and sweat matted his once pristine uniform. The interrogation room was bare, just 4 walls painted in a peeling gray, a single flickering bulb overhead, and the low, constant hum of a power generator somewhere behind the wall. His eyes darted around the room, searching for something, anything, familiar. But there was no comfort here. Only waiting. Only consequences. Across the facility, in a mobile command center lined with monitors and humming processors, Dorian Vale and Colby Jacks sat hunched over a decrypted cluster of Apex Air's secured black box data. The air inside the van was thick with tension and stale coffee. Wires snaked across the floor like vines, and the glow from the screens painted their faces in a ghostly blue light. Dorian's fingers moved fast, lines of code streaming as he bypassed layer after layer of encryption. Come on, he muttered. "Tell me you found something," Colby said, arms crossed, pacing behind him like a coiled spring. Dorian's screen blinked. A new folder opened, hidden inside a mislabeled system log called Catering Inventory. "Gotcha," Dorian whispered. Inside were shipping manifests that didn't match any known food or beverage deliveries. Each code corresponded to international flight numbers, weight discrepancies, containers unlisted on public cargo records. "These aren't sandwiches and coffee, Colby," Dorian said, his voice tightening. "They're hiding something. Something big." Colby leaned in, studying the data. Hidden compartments, off-manifest crates, and look, same signature code across multiple flights, same flight crews. He pointed at one name, Royce Trenner. The room fell silent. Colby's jaw clenched. "They're moving more than people," he said, shaking his head. "Weapons, biotech, maybe even intel." Dorian's brow furrowed as he zoomed in on one specific shipment logged on Flight 709, the flight Nathaniel and Isaiah had taken. No declared origin, no registered content. But there's something else. A biometric lock. "Who's biometric?" Colby asked. Dorian ran the trace. A single name popped up. Wallace Drexler, Apex Air's Vice President of International Operations. Colby's eyes widened. That's not a pawn. That's a general. Meanwhile, deep in the facility, Nathaniel Creer stood in a shadowed observation room watching Royce through a one-way mirror. His expression was unreadable, stoic, carved from stone. But his hands were tight fists at his sides, knuckles white. He didn't blink as Royce trembled in his chair. He didn't flinch as the man who'd nearly suffocated his son now pleaded silently for mercy. Nathaniel remembered the sound Isaiah made, those gasps for air, the desperate cry, the red flush of his cheeks. A helpless sound. A sound that had cut deeper than any battlefield injury ever had. Now he had names. Now he had proof. A slow breath escaped his lips. "They didn't just endanger my son," he whispered, more to himself than anyone else. "They endangered every innocent soul on that plane." Back in the van, Dorian loaded the last of the decrypted files onto a secure drive. "Project Lancer," he said aloud as if naming a ghost. A logistics cover for global smuggling. It runs through Apex. It runs through Drexler. And Royce. Royce was the inside hand. He feared the baby would draw attention to the crate, Colby realized. That's why he sprayed the kid. Not out of annoyance, Dorian said grimly. Out of panic. Silence hung heavy in the air. Finally, Nathaniel stepped into the van. He looked at the screen, at the evidence, at the lives hidden in codes and coordinates. I need an hour, he said. For what? Colby asked. Nathaniel glanced toward the compound. To make Royce talk. Dorian hesitated. He's already broken. He's scared. Nathaniel's voice was quiet, but it hit with the weight of a verdict. Good. Fear makes people remember what they tried to forget. Dorian handed him the drive. We go public with this? No, Nathaniel said. Not yet. First we burn the roots, then we salt the soil. Colby nodded once. Then, what do we do now? Nathaniel looked at them both, eyes dark but calm. We prepare to move, he said. They crossed the line. Now I redraw it and fire. Sirens howled in the distance like wolves closing in on prey. Inside Apex Air's towering headquarters, tension twisted the air as employees scrambled behind glass partitions. The CEO stood rigid at the podium, tie crooked, fingers trembling as he clutched the prepared statement meant to distance the company from the scandal unraveling around them. But before he could utter a word, red and blue lights flooded the marble atrium. The front doors burst open. Federal agents, everyone down. Dozens of black-clad officers stormed the lobby with practiced precision. The CEO dropped the paper, face drained of color. Shouts echoed as desks were overturned, computers seized, and high-ranking staff corralled into conference rooms for immediate questioning. The press conference was over before it began. The building, once a symbol of power and wealth, was now a crime scene. But Nathaniel Creer wasn't there to witness the fall. 30 miles away, under the cover of a dying sun, he and Colby Jacks approached the rusted doors of Hangar 12. The air smelled of metal and old fuel. The facility, cloaked in silence and shadow, had once served as a maintenance bay, now repurposed for something far darker. Cameras are dead, Colby said, crouched near the door's panel. They wiped everything from outside access. Nathaniel nodded, his eyes scanning the perimeter. That means they're hiding something worth dying over. They moved inside, flashlights piercing the darkness. Rows of containers lined the floor, each stamped with Apex shipping codes. But it was the back wall that caught their attention. A large steel chamber, sealed tight, marked with a red triangle. The symbol from the footage. The symbol tied to Project Lancer. This is it, Nathaniel whispered, hand tightening on his pistol. Colby slung his medical bag behind his back and approached with a crowbar. On 3? Nathaniel gave a short nod. 3. With a groan of metal, the chamber door creaked open. The stench hit first, acrid, chemical, cold. Inside, the chamber was lit only by flickering overhead bulbs. Shelves lined the walls, each packed with crates marked medical supplies that, upon closer inspection, contained nothing of the sort. Weapons-grade components, modified biotech, data drives labeled under code names. And then, the final horror, files. Dozens of folders, each bearing photos of faces, passengers, children, logs detailing dates, locations, prices. Trafficking manifests, Colby said grimly. They weren't smuggling weapons, they were smuggling people. Nathaniel didn't speak. He didn't need to. His jaw clenched, eyes locked on a laminated ID badge nestled between the folders. The face on it? Royce Trenner. I want everything recorded, he said, voice low. As Colby lifted his camera, movement flashed in the shadows. Nathaniel caught it just in time. Down, he shouted, shoving Colby to the side. Gunfire erupted, bullets slamming into steel walls. 2 figures emerged from behind crates, Apex security operatives armed and prepared. Colby was grazed along the arm, stumbling to cover behind a container. Nathaniel rolled behind a forklift, returning fire with precise bursts. One operative fell with a cry as a bullet slammed into his knee. The other tried flanking, only to take a shot to the shoulder. He dropped his weapon, groaning in pain. Smoke drifted lazily through the hangar as silence began to settle again, but only for a moment. Footsteps echoed from the far side of the chamber. Nathaniel turned. Royce. Drenched in sweat, his shirt torn and bloody from an earlier injury, Royce emerged from a shadowy side door with a pistol in hand. He was limping, clearly injured, but his eyes were wild with desperation. "You don't understand what you're doing," he shouted, voice cracking. "They'll kill you. All of you." Nathaniel stepped forward, gun steady in his grip. "You tried to cover for them. You endangered my child. You knew." Royce staggered back, clutching at a wall for support. "I was trying to survive. You think you can win? You don't even know the half of it." Nathaniel's face remained still. "Then tell me. Right now." Royce hesitated. His hand twitched, a small movement, but enough to betray the decision forming in his mind. He turned to run. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. The gunshots cracked through the vast emptiness of Hangar 12, echoing off the steel walls like thunder rolling through a canyon. Royce dropped to the ground with a guttural cry, his hands clutching his stomach where the bullet had struck. Blood seeped between his fingers, dark against the concrete, but he was alive, barely. Nathaniel lowered his weapon slowly, the muzzle still smoking, his breath calm but controlled, like a man who had rehearsed this moment 100 times in silence. Colby rushed forward, gun drawn, scanning for any more threats. The warehouse was a maze of shadows and steel crates, each one stamped with the red triangle they had come to recognize. They knew what was inside, and they knew who had tried to keep it buried. "I've got him," Colby said, kicking Royce's weapon out of reach and cuffing him with swift, practiced hands. Royce groaned, his voice wet and trembling, but Colby didn't flinch. He pressed a cloth to the wound to slow the bleeding. "You're lucky he didn't aim for the heart." Sirens pierced the air moments later, their rising wail a signal that reinforcements had finally arrived. A convoy of federal agents stormed through the hangar's main entrance, weapons raised, lights sweeping across the chaos. The lead agent, a stocky man in a dark tactical vest, paused as he took in the sight before him. Royce incapacitated, crates flung open to reveal illegal tech, and Nathaniel standing at the center, unmoving, unarmed, hands raised above his head. "Everything's in here," Nathaniel said, voice steady, nodding toward the rows of crates. "They used your uniforms, your aircraft, your passengers." The agent held his gaze for a long moment, scanning for any sign of threat. Then he lowered his weapon. "We've seen the files. You did what you had to." Royce was wheeled onto a stretcher by 2 paramedics in full gear. His face was pale, eyes wide, but his lips still curled into a bitter snarl as he passed Nathaniel. "This isn't over," he rasped, his voice weak but laced with venom. Nathaniel didn't blink. "It is, for you," he replied coldly, his words cutting deeper than the bullet ever had. Colby stayed behind with the agents to secure the evidence, but Nathaniel had already turned to leave, his mission complete for now. His steps echoed down the hangar's concrete floor as the weight of the night settled on his shoulders. The silence that followed wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that comes after a storm, the kind that knows another storm might be coming. Hours later, back at the hospital, the world felt different, softer, quieter. Isaiah stirred beneath a pale blue blanket, his tiny hands twitching in sleep. Machines hummed gently beside the bed, tracking his breathing, steady, strong, recovering. Nathaniel sat beside him, the sterile room a sanctuary after the fire of combat. His hands trembled faintly, not from fear, but from the overwhelming surge of relief and rage that still battled beneath the surface. He reached into a small paper bag and pulled out a plush stuffed animal, a soft bear in a pilot's cap. With care, he placed it next to Isaiah, brushing the baby's cheek with the back of his finger. Isaiah shifted, let out a tiny sigh, and returned to his dreams. Nathaniel exhaled slowly, watching his son as if memorizing every breath. On the television mounted in the corner, the news anchor's voice played over footage of Hangar 12 being sealed off. We now turn to the scandal that has shaken the nation. The Apex Air incident, now being referred to as the baby case, has sparked outrage as more details emerge. What began as a passenger complaint has unraveled into a massive smuggling conspiracy with international implications. Officials confirmed the involvement of high-ranking employees and covert cargo operations using commercial flights. The volume was low, but Nathaniel heard every word. His name wasn't mentioned, and he preferred it that way. Let the world talk about justice. Let them debate law and failure. He'd lived the price of it. His eyes remained on Isaiah. Not the screen, not the past, not even the promise of retribution. Then, finally, Nathaniel allowed himself a small, weary smile, one of triumph, pain, and the quiet satisfaction that something rotten had been brought into the light. Sometimes, he whispered more to himself than to anyone else, bullets speak louder than excuses. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. It was tucked neatly into Nathaniel Creer's weathered mailbox. No postage, no stamp, no return address. Just a plain white envelope, thin as air, resting silently atop a pile of advertisements and utility bills. The coastal wind whispered through the narrow road leading to his cottage, and the sea beyond churned as if sensing something had shifted. Nathaniel stood there for a long moment, the sun casting soft morning light across the porch, painting long shadows across the floorboards. He knew, even before he opened it. There was a sharpness in the fold, a deliberate stillness to the paper, as though it had been placed, not delivered. He stepped inside, Isaiah sleeping in a bassinet nearby, the rhythmic breath of the child offering the only sense of peace in the quiet room. Nathaniel opened the envelope with surgical care. Inside, a single strip of white card. 2 words, handwritten in small, clean letters, "Still watching." The handwriting was precise, cold, calculated. Not a flourish wasted, not a curve out of place. Nathaniel felt the air leave his lungs in one long exhale. He crossed the room, set the card gently on the table, and closed all the blinds. The seaside light vanished, and the room dimmed to a dull, private gray. Then he picked up his secure phone, the one Dorian had outfitted months ago with anti-trace encryption. He tapped a number he had memorized, one that hadn't been used since Apex's collapse. Dorian answered immediately. "You got something?" Nathaniel asked. "Just finished tracing the ink," Dorian replied, no hesitation. "It's custom, manufactured by a private contractor that worked under shell aliases from the Lancer financing web. You remember that ghost firm we flagged in Dubai?" Nathaniel's eyes narrowed. "Meriton Systems." "Yeah, the ink batch was one of theirs." The silence between them hummed with meaning. "Prints?" Nathaniel asked. "Clean," Dorian said. "Completely sterile. Whoever wrote that note didn't just avoid smudging. They used gloves, then wiped it down. The pressure marks suggest deliberate control. This was a message, Nate. Not a threat. A signal Nathaniel's fingers clenched around the phone. "So they're regrouping?" "Looks that way, or at least someone is watching what's left." He hung up, then sat quietly, eyes locked on the message. The months after the scandal had given Nathaniel a strange kind of peace. Apex Air had crumbled. Royce was in federal custody, stripped of rank and rights, his name now synonymous with betrayal. Governments around the world had revoked airline contracts. Lawsuits had poured in from families whose lives were torn apart by hidden operations they'd never even known existed. The headlines had screamed justice. But Nathaniel knew better. Justice didn't scream. It whispered. It watched. And sometimes it waited. He had refused the spotlight. After giving his evidence behind closed doors, he'd left the city, trading surveillance cameras and political noise for a small, fog-kissed town with one grocery store, a rocky beach, and a population too small for gossip. He lived under an alias, kept his head down, and spent every morning walking Isaiah along the dunes, whispering stories of a world he hoped his son would never have to fight in. But that hope cracked the moment he held the note in his hands. He placed it in a steel box and slid it beneath the floorboards. Then he moved to the bookshelf and pulled down a small framed photo of Isaiah, taken on his first day back from the hospital. Behind it was a concealed compartment where an unregistered firearm, a set of burner IDs, and an encrypted hard drive lay untouched. Nathaniel ran his fingers over the items without taking any of them. Not yet. Instead, he walked to Isaiah's crib and knelt beside it. The child stirred but didn't wake. Nathaniel brushed a hand gently across the boy's hair and felt the weight of everything he'd tried to bury rise again. Not in panic, not in anger, but in resolve. The kind forged in silence. He stood up and locked every door, checked every window twice, and sat in the farthest corner of the living room. The note still burned into his mind. Outside, the wind picked up. The tide pushed harder against the shore. Somewhere, far from this place, someone had taken the time to remind him that the war wasn't over. Not really. And he knew what that meant. He wouldn't run. He wouldn't hide. But he would wait, and when they moved again, so would he. Only this time, he wouldn't be cleaning up a mess. He'd be burning down the system that made it possible. Nathaniel leaned back, exhaled slowly, and whispered to the stillness, "Just because I stopped swinging doesn't mean I dropped the hammer." The wind hissed through the pine trees as Nathaniel shut the cabin door behind him, locking it with a quiet click. Rain patted the metal roof in soft bursts, distant thunder grumbling over the mountains. Inside, the air was tense, thick with the scent of wood smoke, coffee, and the weight of unspoken decisions. Colby sat at the small kitchen table, his hand resting on a stack of satellite images and shipping manifests, while Dorian stood by the window, tapping something on a rugged tablet. Nathaniel didn't speak at first. He walked to the map pinned to the wall, a sprawling web of red thread and black pins connecting flight paths, flagged names, and corporate shells that no longer officially existed. His eyes landed on one photo in particular, a grainy surveillance still of a man stepping out of a private jet in Belize. The face was blurred, but the posture was familiar, relaxed, entitled. He turned to the others, his voice low and certain. "I'm done reacting." Colby looked up slowly, brow furrowed beneath a scar that caught the light. "You mean—" "I mean it's time we go on offense," Nathaniel interrupted. He wasn't angry, he was clear, focused, like a blade that had been honed over months of waiting. Dorian placed the tablet on the table and crossed his arms. "I've been pulling strings, quietly. We've got cracks forming. One of the shell firms tied to Project Lancer just moved $2 million in untraceable currency to a logistics front in Jakarta, same holding group that owned the crate beneath Isaiah's cabin." He paused, glancing at Nathaniel. "They're rerouting faster than we can expose them, but we're close." Nathaniel nodded once, then walked to the window and stared out into the night. The forest seemed calm, but he knew better. "We need eyes inside, and not just digital ones." Colby leaned back in his chair. "You're thinking of building a team." "I already have," Nathaniel replied. "Off-grid, loyal, trained. Some of them owe me. Some just want to burn what Lancer built." A silence fell over the room as the three men considered the magnitude of what they were proposing. It wasn't just about Apex Air anymore. It was about the layers above it, the invisible scaffolding that had held up a network capable of trafficking tech, people, even influence, without leaving fingerprints. Colby broke the silence. "If we go after them, really go after them, they won't play fair. You know that." "They never did," Nathaniel said. His jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "That's why we level the field." Dorian pulled a folder from his backpack and spread it open. Inside were profiles, photos, bios, intel briefs. "I've been in touch with a former customs officer who flagged a shipment in Istanbul last year. Lost his job the next day. Another guy used to run internal audits at a cargo hub in Dakar. He's been off the grid since he filed a report that vanished before it hit any agency inbox." "These are ghosts," Colby murmured. "No," Nathaniel corrected. "These are men who want justice but needed someone to believe them first." The lights flickered as the storm outside intensified. Somewhere in the distance, a branch cracked under the weight of wind. Nathaniel moved to the table, placed both hands flat on its surface, and looked at his old friends. "Our goal isn't revenge. It's prevention. If they ever rise again, they'll do it in the dark." "And we'll be waiting there," Colby finished, his voice firm. The three exchanged nods, an unspoken pact forming between them, one built on trust, loss, and the shared weight of what they'd seen. Outside, the rain softened, and the storm's edge began to pass. Later that night, in the quiet safety of a home tucked along the coast, Nathaniel watched his son take his first wobbly steps. Isaiah's arms flailed for balance, his tiny feet landing awkwardly on the carpet, a grin plastered across his face as he reached for the couch. Nathaniel knelt nearby, arms open but not interfering, his eyes misted with something more than just pride. Every step the child took was a defiance of everything that had nearly taken him. Behind them, the fireplace crackled. The world outside was still dangerous, still crawling with shadows Nathaniel hadn't yet hunted down, but this moment was pure. He scooped Isaiah into his arms as the boy stumbled, laughing softly. The warmth of that little heartbeat against his chest reminded him why he had to keep fighting, not out of anger, but out of love. He turned to the window, staring out into the vast, silent sea. His reflection looked back at him, older, worn, but burning with quiet purpose. "I don't want him to know fear. I want him to know fire when it counts." Dorian Vale froze the drone footage and leaned forward, squinting at the grainy image on his monitor. The red triangle wasn't large, but it was distinct, painted onto the side of a supply crate that appeared for just 3 seconds before the feed cut out. He replayed it again, slow motion this time, enhancing the frame-by-frame clarity with every software trick he knew. The crate was being loaded into the belly of a cargo plane at an unnamed airstrip in South Asia. flanked by men in dark uniforms without insignias. He sat back, heart pounding. He had seen that symbol before. It was the same triangle he and Nathaniel had found years ago inside Hangar 12, stamped on sealed containers that had once transported more than just supplies. The triangle wasn't just a logo, it was a calling card, a warning, a whisper from the shadows that the network they'd crippled had not vanished, only scattered. He didn't hesitate. Within seconds, he had his encrypted line to Nathaniel open. The screen flickered and Nathaniel's face appeared, calm, aged by resolve, yet alert. "It's not over," Dorian said without preamble, turning his camera to the paused image on his screen. Nathaniel said nothing for a moment. The air between them thickened with recognition, not surprise. He slowly closed the photo album on his desk. Inside, pictures of Isaiah's second birthday, innocent smiles lit by candlelight and laughter. His hands hovered for a beat too long over the album's leather cover before he looked back at the screen. His voice was low, steady. "Then we do what we always do. We fly toward the storm." The blast of the flashbang tore through the morning fog like a thunderclap, bathing the shadows of the airstrip in sharp, white light. Nathaniel moved first, boots slamming into the cracked concrete as the raid erupted into motion. Colby was a step behind him, rifle raised, eyes sharp and scanning. Dorian's voice echoed faintly through the earpieces, calm but urgent as he relayed movement signatures from the overhead satellite feed. 2 heat signatures northeast hangar, 4 more converging on the south lot, no visual on the central crate hub yet. Nathaniel didn't answer. His focus was razor-thin, his breath even. He adjusted the vest strap digging into his shoulder, feeling the photo tucked inside brush against his chest, a reminder, a fuel line for everything he'd become. The compound ahead looked like any aid depot, white tents, cargo containers, forklift lanes, but beneath the paint and paperwork, they knew what it really was, an extraction point for stolen futures. They moved through the first structure silently. The team split into tactical pairs. The warehouse smelled of synthetic oil and damp rust. Inside, boxes labeled as medical relief and child nutrition supplies were stacked to the ceiling. Nathaniel pulled a crowbar from his belt, jammed it into the nearest crate, and wrenched it open. Inside, not food, not medicine, rows of microchip modules and encrypted drives wrapped in foam padding, classified tech, some pieces even bearing military signatures. Colby swore under his breath, but Nathaniel only stared for a moment, then moved on. "Confirmation. Illegal cargo in Sector A. Keep moving," he muttered into the comm. Gunfire crackled near the east wall. "Contact, east quadrant," a voice crackled in his earpiece. Nathaniel didn't hesitate. "Colby, with me. Dorian, lock exit paths on thermal. Don't let anyone vanish." They raced into the open yard, where 2 armed guards attempted to flee toward a grounded cargo plane. Colby dropped one with a clean shot to the thigh. The second ducked behind a fuel barrel, but Nathaniel flanked fast and hard, tackling the man to the ground with a precision born from years of covert fieldwork. The guard swung wildly, landing a punch that split Nathaniel's lip, but the fight didn't last long. A swift blow to the ribs, a twist of the arm, and the man was down, wheezing. Nathaniel wiped the blood from his mouth with the back of his glove, scanning the perimeter. More boots on the ground now, reinforcements from local allies and satellite-linked operatives descending with practiced urgency. "Dorian, status?" he asked, voice tight. "I've got eyes on the red triangle crates. Center hub. Surveillance drones are live. We're feeding data to Intersec and Global Aid Command now." "Copy. Mark them for extraction." They moved toward the heart of the compound. As they entered the final hangar, the cold air struck them, a chilling reminder of what they might find inside. Nathaniel's hand paused on the metal handle before pushing it open. Inside were the crates, the same ones he'd seen in footage years ago, red triangles on their lids, silent as graves. A low hum came from within the hangar's server racks. Surveillance footage from God knows how many ports flickered across screens mounted to the wall, live feeds of children being led off planes, taken into windowless vans under the guise of relocation. Colby's hands tightened into fists. These aren't just trafficking lines. These are staging zones. Nathaniel's voice was cold. They always were. He lifted the camera from his shoulder and began documenting everything. Crate serials, monitor footage, timestamps, crew IDs, evidence. Unshakable, undeniable. One crate sat half open, a child's toy visible just beneath the packing foam. Nathaniel didn't speak. He just stared. and something behind his eyes turned darker, older. "They thought we'd stop at Apex," he said quietly. "They thought wrong." The door behind them burst open, one last straggler, armed and frantic. He aimed wildly. Colby spun and fired, dropping him before he could even scream. Dorian's voice crackled again. "We've got full uplink. The world's watching now." Nathaniel stepped out into the dawn light, blinking at the brightness that pierced the haze of gunpowder and truth. Helicopters were arriving in the distance. The raid had ended, but the war had only changed shape. Colby approached, brushing soot from his sleeve. "We did it." "No," Nathaniel replied. "We started it." He looked down at his vest, pulled out the worn photo of Isaiah, his boy, his reason. The child who smiled despite the world trying to choke the breath from his lungs. He tucked it away gently, turned back to face the field of wreckage and reclaimed truth, and whispered, "They sprayed my son with poison. Now I spray the truth through every crack they thought was sealed. Because no one sprays a child and walks away clean." 4 minutes later, the bullets flew, and his impunity shattered. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It addresses themes of cruelty, abuse of power, and the rapid escalation of violence. Its purpose is to raise awareness about the importance of compassion, accountability, and protecting the vulnerable, while provoking thought about the devastating consequences of reckless and dehumanizing actions.